Hi friends, welcome to my bedroom. I'm really ill at the moment. Feeling a lot better, but I've been really ill, and I thought talking about books would make me feel better. So we're just gonna talk about some books that I've been reading over the last few months. I wanted to do my favorite books, realized that I don't really want to do that because a lot of them I've already talked about at length and I don't know if I have anything else to add. And also, I've read so many books since we last talked that I don't want to end the year without talking about those books. So, these are those books. Pretty basic, pretty simple. Um, yeah, let's get into it. So, probably the coolest, most unexpected book that I loved this year. Well, I don't know. Take that with a grain of salt because a lot of these books were cool and unexpected, and I didn't think I would love them as much as I did. But this one especially, Piranesi by Susanna Clark. This is the book that won the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. And it's a really odd and slow and surprisingly gripping for how slow it begins read. So Piranesi is basically the name of a architect or an artist, I believe, from sometime in Rome, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but basically look it up, look up Piranesi because the artwork is beautiful. And so basically we follow this character who's called Piranesi or is named Piranesi by another character who is trapped in this series of endless halls and rooms and corridors of a house that is basically infinite. And this character believes that this house is everything, is the entire universe essentially. The house is constructed in a super interesting way where the upper floors have clouds and that's where rain comes from. The lower floors are the sea and the rivers and water, and they've got fish and things like that. And then the middle kind of floors are where he can live. So it's a really interesting kind of magical realist concept. And this character is basically an explorer, or he's a cartographer. He's trying to map out the house. There's one other character that Piranesi can interact with throughout the novel. He calls him the Other, and their relationship is super unique and interesting. And as you get to know more about Piranesi's life, certain things just don't add up, and there's a mystery about how everything works. And Susanna Clark is very good at writing mysteries. I've never actually read a mystery novel other than Sherlock Holmes. But this is an incredibly gripping book. Once you reach a point where you start asking questions, she's so good at planting those questions in the reader's mind and kind of forcing you or tempting you to answer them or tempting you to read on so that the kind of questions get answered. So super vague premise. I'm sure you've heard about this book loads on the internet, but I loved it. I thought it was so well written. I really enjoyed the format, which is basically Piranesi's journal entries, and he has a really sort of old school classicist nostalgic way of writing. It felt like reading like the diaries of Marcus Aurelius or something, if Marcus Aurelius was living in a magical realist world. It's super wholesome and really grounded in I think ecological thinking. So there's a lot of talk about treating the house with respect, and the house, like I said, is kind of a metaphor for the world, for the planet, for the universe. So I think this book has a lot to offer in loads of different types of readings. I know a lot of people have read this from the perspective of chronic illness and being unable to leave the house, and I know that Susanna Clarke herself did write this after a long period of suffering with chronic illness, and so that's definitely a valid reading of it. I do think there's a lot of ecological thinking in it as well, and it's just a fantastic novel that totally deserved the prize, in my opinion. I only read one other book from the Women's Prize, but like this was so phenomenal, and like short, sweet, slow yet gripping. I don't know what else to say. It's so good. Maybe my favorite book of the year. If we're gonna, I don't know. Since I mentioned that I only read one other book from the Women's Prize, I will mention it here, which is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. This is a book about Twitter, basically. It's written very much like internet speak. And I know that Patricia Lockwood's written another book called Priest Daddy, which I think a lot of people also say is very much a book that's kind of been birthed out of internet speak. But I think this book has a lot of really interesting things to say. I did tabulate it because I was thinking of writing an essay about it. And I did start taking notes about it. But basically, it's a book in two parts. The first half of the book is all about the first half of the book is all about what it's like to be online and what that takes away from the real world, or like questions of virtuality and materiality, and like how do we not reconcile the two, but what is the trade-off and what is the cost of being online? What is the body? Things like that, like really philosophical questions. Super funny as well, by the way. Like, as I said, it's about Twitter. And so there's a lot of stuff in here that's like, could be a tweet, maybe is a tweet. A lot of really absurd stuff that comes out of like meme culture and yeah, like internet things. But the second half of the book, there's like a tragedy that happens for the character, and she's kind of forced into the opposite perspective of like not being able to engage with the internet in the same way, not being able to see its importance in the same way. I had a conversation about this book with a professor of mine, because we were talking about like short fiction and the world, and how it's like the internet has radically changed the way that we engage with fictions. And I asked him what he thought about this book, if he's read it, and he said that he really disliked it, and he couldn't really name why. And so we were chatting about like why it could have been, and what he like, you know, what it was about the book exactly. And I kind of came to the conclusion, in agreement with him, that the event that is the turning point of the book, the thing that happens that launches us into the tragedy portion, and like the book resolves, or the climax of the book, let's say, is, it feels, not that it was inauthentic, because I'm pretty sure you read them, if you read the acknowledgements, this was like based on a true event, but it's more that what happened felt like it was made into a little bit of a, not that it was commodified or fetishized, like I don't know what the right word is, but it just felt like it wasn't written so that the author could process it. It wasn't written so that it was to be made into something like, it wasn't written from a place of like love, weirdly weirdly. Like I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but it just read in a way that felt a little bit insensitive, or yeah, like it just felt a little bit insensitive, maybe because by through the nature of the form, which she was, I think, phenomenally, like doing phenomenally well, playing with the form of the internet and the way that that sort of fetishizes and commodifies tragedy. So there's a possibility that that was almost intentional, but like as a reader, and I think my professor especially, felt like really disjointed or disconnected from the emotions and the like authenticity of emotions that come with that kind of tragedy. And the idea that when you write about something that is a tragic event too close to the event itself, there's a possibility that you don't do it with the grace and with a distance that maybe it deserves, with the honor that that kind of event deserves. So I'm not 100% on board. Like I definitely lost a little bit of interest in the book once it became about that plot. And I would be really curious to hear what people with disability, what disabled readers have to say about this book, because it also felt a little bit insensitive on that front as well. I don't really know. I'm a little bit on the fence about this. Like it would have been one of my favorite books of the year if it wasn't about what it was about in such a seemingly fetishizing kind of way. Like I know a lot of people on BookTube talk about like tragedy porn, or like, you know, like A Little Life, things like that. I don't think it's at that extreme, but I do think it could have been done better, differently. It could have been avoided entirely. I didn't feel like that was the point of the book when you were first reading it, and so once it enters into the plot, you're just kind of like, okay, I guess it's about this now. I guess you just needed a plot, so you just threw this terrible thing in here. I don't know. I'm a little bit on the fence about it. But I do think the writing is phenomenal and the form is phenomenal, and it's really doing something super interesting, and I would love to read more books that are so steeped in internet culture and the absurdity and the philosophy and the phenomenology of like what it means to be on the internet. So yeah, those were the women's prize books. Let's keep going with fiction. Let's just get the fictions. Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Filia. National Book Award finalist, published in 2020. I was gonna say 2017, I don't know why. Some of the stories in here were published in 2017, but this is a short story collection. As it says, it's about church ladies. It's about a community of Black women who, I don't know if they go to the same church, but they're all in some way, shape, or form related to or interested in or connected to church community. I bought this book for a friend, and I bought myself a copy, and we read it together because she's a churchgoer, and I thought it would be really interesting for her to read about like Black church in America, and for me to read about church in general, and for us to have conversations about faith and about race through this book. So this was a really fantastic like buddy read, I would say. Like if you want a book to spark conversation, this is a great book to do that. I actually picked this up because Julesy, who's one of my favorite creators on YouTube, has a book club called Smart Brown Girls, and she had an interview with the author about this book, like a live that I watched, and I was so intrigued by some of their conversations that I was like, okay, I gotta buy this book. Gotta read this book. So yeah, this is a phenomenal book. It's so short, like I literally can't even believe it's like less than 200 pages. Yet there are so many stories, and all of the stories are so well written, and it's so accessible, and it's like genuinely like made me laugh, made me cry, made me like ooh and ah, and like I was so taken by some of these stories. The first story is really steamy. There's a lot of like queer narratives in here as well. There's a lot of narratives about intergenerational differences and like what it's like to be like a grandmother of someone living now, coming from such a different generation, but then also what it's like, yeah, just between mothers and daughters, like that's literally the essence of this book. It's just mothers and daughters. And I just absolutely adored it. It was so good. Like I literally don't know what to say without like telling you one of the stories, and I can't do it as well as if you just picked up the book and read it. It's so worth the money. It's a little bit on the pricey side because it's from West Virginia University Press, but it's so worth it. And it's going to become a series, I think. I'm not sure which streaming service is gonna, I don't know like where exactly, but I know for a fact it's going to become a series. So get on that before it does. But yeah, it's so good. There's this, okay, the one thing I will say, like from one of the stories, there's this one story where this girl, sorry. There's this one story where a girl, thinks her mom is dating God. Like the first line, it's so sweet. It's a story called Peach Cobbler. It's probably my favorite story in the entire book. It says, my mother's peach top. This is the first line of the story, which is like probably the best first line that I've ever read. My mother's peach cobbler was so good, it made God himself cheat on his wife. And it's basically about this girl who thinks that the God and the reverend at her local church are the same person, and so she keeps saying like God this, God that, but she's making all of these like terrible like statements about God like cheating on his wife, or God being fat, or God like eating so much peach cobbler. And it's like that's just the reverend at her church, but it's so funny and it's so good and it's so sweet and heartwarming, and it genuinely like one of the best short story collections I've ever read. And like thank you again to Carmen Maria Machado for like getting me into short story collections, because this was so worth the read, and I don't think I would have picked it up. And I hadn't picked it up. I'd been hearing about it and I didn't pick it up because I was like, I don't read short story collections, but like this is a really good one. I don't think there's a single bad story in here. Okay, another short, not a short story collection necessarily, but like a short novella, Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. I'd heard so much about Sarah Moss and I was like, okay, I gotta just pick something up by her. It's really hard to describe what this book is, but let's just say it's a character study. It's very much about the characters, it's very much about character dynamics, but it's set in a really interesting like time and place and setting. So it's set in Northumberland, which is in the north of England, and it's about a 17-year-old Sylvie whose father is a bit of a misogynist, and he's quite abusive, and him and her mother and Sylvie are on this trip with a group of students and a professor who are really interested in like Iron Age sacrifice. So there's this like campsite where a lot of like historical events happened during the Iron Age that the students are like studying. And Sylvie and her family are like her dad's like the bus driver, I think, but he's like super interested in archaeology. And so her and her mom are kind of under the thumb of her dad, like in a kind of really old school, like patriarchal, like Iron Age kind of way. And it's really very much a commentary on the differences between rural and urban communities, the differences between North and South classism in the UK, but also like old and new, and like ancient history being something when we admire or we look up to or we think fondly, nostalgically of old school ancient civilizations, we often forget at what cost they existed in. I don't know if that sentence made sense. Like at what cost they existed. And in Sylvie's case, the cost is her freedom, her mother's freedom, their feelings of safety, etc. Anyway, it's a really short book, but the tension is so high throughout the whole book, and like you just don't want to stop reading. Like I didn't want to stop reading. It's so beautifully written. Sarah Moss is an incredibly talented author. I think this book specifically was edited by Max Porter, who wrote Grief is a Thing with Feathers, which I read earlier this year and I really loved. Yeah, so it's really like well written, very concise, like every word matters. And another thing that this book really made me think about was food and like food practices throughout the ages. And I found out actually in doing a little bit of research that Sarah Moss has written an academic book about food. I think it's called Spilling the Beans, Women and Food Practices from like the 1900s, something like that. Like I don't know the exact title, but I can leave it in the description. I'll also leave the Julesy video interview with Disha Filia in the description as well. But yeah, like clearly Sarah Moss is very interested in food, and she makes the reader very interested in food and like writes about food in such a way that I don't think anyone has ever made me, any book that I've ever read has ever made me think about food so much. And again, same for this book and the Peach Cobbler story, but like I don't know, like it honestly shocked me how well the food was written in this book. and it made me question, like, why don't more people write food into books? Like food is such an essential part of all of our lives and we don't write about it enough. So that's a little tangent, but yeah, very tense, very intense, very well written, and very important book, I would say. Really, really interesting. Loved it. Okay, let's keep going, swiftly moving on. A few funny books to break the ice between all those intense books. Embroideries by Marianne Satrapi, author of Persepolis. This is a graphic novel in Marianne Satrapi's beautiful monochrome style. This is a book about, I think it's like 8 women, maybe 9 because they might be looking at one of the other characters, women in a family and family friends and stuff, all talking over tea after the patriarch of the family goes to bed, and they're talking about like their sex lives and their romantic histories and their like lack of or exceeding, like overstepping of sort of expectations about what it's like to be in relations with men. And this is obviously Marianne Satrapi is Iranian, and so these are like Iranian women, and it's so interesting. it's so funny, and it made me feel so seen in like the weirdest way, like just not like me feel seen, but like the idea of like these Middle Eastern women just like dishing over tea, like literally spilling the tea. So good. It was so good. It's genuinely like, I read it during a bookshop shift because we were having like quite a slow shift, and it was, you know, just there, and I was like, oh my god, okay, I have to read this. And then at the end of the shift I was like, I have to buy this. It was £4, but it's so good. I don't know, like there were moments that were like shocking and uncomfortable and kind of like scary and heart pounding, because obviously a lot of these women have gone through like some sort of trauma, but loads of it is just literally like absurd and hilarious and like really heartwarming, or like just funny, like funny in the sense of like when a joke or like when a context like builds an expectation for something and then it completely takes like a swing and you're like, that's not where I expected that to go, like funny in that way. So good. And I think more, I just love Marianne Satrapi, and I would love to read more about Iran. Like I'm really interested in like Persian history and Iran, especially in the history of Iran. But there's something also about reading about the sex lives of Middle Eastern women that's so empowering, that we don't see very often, that's so important. And I think the fact that this is in a graphic novel format makes it even more accessible, and even makes it feel even more like you're there, you know. And I love this so much. So good, so funny, so important. Again, the only graphic novel I read this year, but like best graphic novel I've read in many years. So really nice. Another funny book, The Salmon of Doubt by Douglas Adams. I was considering doing a paper or a dissertation on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because those were my favorite books, and I was like, oh, I've always wanted to write something academic about Douglas Adams, and if I'm gonna do it, like now is the time. So I went to the bookshop and I was like, I wonder if there's anything not Hitchhikers that I could like read by Douglas Adams. And I knew that he'd written Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which is his other series. And I always thought that The Salmon of Doubt was just like the third book in that series. But I went to the bookshop and I saw this edition and I was like, it looks interesting. And I saw a foreword by Stephen Fry and I was like, okay, let me read the foreword. And then I look at the contents page and I just looked through and I realized that this is an essay collection by Douglas Adams. This is not, well, this is, it also includes a chapter or a few chapters at the very end called The Salmon of Doubt, which is an extension of the Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency series, although as it says inside the book, The Salmon of Doubt was meant to be Dirk Gently's, but Douglas Adams always then after writing it intended for it to be like part 6 of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So it's really unclear like what was going to happen with The Salmon of Doubt. But point being, this is a series of freaking essays. This is not just a fiction book. And that made me so joyful. Like, you have no idea, like the feeling, the elated feeling of finding out that your favorite writer of your favorite series has published work that you've never read before. I was thrilled. Obviously, I immediately bought it and I immediately started reading it. And I love it. It's so good. Like, I've tabulated it again because I thought I was going to write something about it, but I've also just tabulated like my favorite parts of it. And it's just so eclectic. Like, Douglas Adams, again, this is not going to be a book for you if you haven't read Hitchhikers or if you don't love Douglas Adams already, but like, this was published posthumously. He died suddenly in 2003, I want to say, or 2001. Yeah, he died in 2001. This was published in 2003. Is that right? Fact check myself. published in 2002. I don't know where the number 2003 came to me. So he died suddenly in 2001. This was published in 2002 and like collected by his friends and family, and Stephen Fry wrote the foreword. There's an essay in here on P.J. Wodehouse, who's also like huge inspiration of Douglas Adams, hilarious comic author. There's essays about artificial intelligence and God and faith and nature and diving. Douglas Adams used to scuba dive. Like I felt so connected to him. There's essays about the early internet, which are so outdated at this point, but so interesting, and essays about like the turn of the millennium, and like they're just like little bits and pieces that have been published in different places and now collected in here, and I'm just so happy that I that I found this. There's a hilarious essay about Australia that I sent to an Australian friend of mine because I was like, this is the biggest, like, Douglas Adams is just taking the piss out of Australia as a country, and it's hilarious. I'll try to find it. Actually, it's really funny. Oh, I can't find it at the moment, but basically in it he says like Australia is one of those places that it makes me feel like really nervous not knowing what's happening there at all times, because it's basically like land of like ultimate danger or whatever. It's like the way he puts it is just freaking hilarious. But yeah, I can't find it at the moment, but just so funny, brought me so much joy. So happy that I read it, and so like I've literally been putting off reading Dirk Gently because I'm like, I do not want to have read everything that Douglas Adams ever wrote. I did find out through this book that he did write another book called Last Chance to See, which was basically the safari that he took, looking for like almost extinct creatures and just trying to see them all and write about them in pursuit of like ecological awareness and trying to promote like ecological thinking. And clearly he was just very much on that wavelength, which is awesome as well, because reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you can't really tell that overtly. It's more of like the philosophy of Hitchhikers is more like of an absurd philosophy, and then Dirk Gently is where he really gets sort of more political about capitalism and pollution and waste and extinction and stuff like that. But there's definitely traces of that in Hitchhikers, and there's definitely loads of more overt stuff about that and his activism in here. So that's pretty cool. Loved this. Super funny. Okay, back to a few more serious things and then some poems. I read in my like, I had this like interest. Sorry, I'm just gonna put this bookmark in here, but just because I was taking notes about this. I was gonna write an essay. Don't know if I'm ever gonna write any of these essays, but I had a brief interest in machines. Like for a week or two, I was like really like deep diving into loads of reading about machines, and I read this book after reading No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood, and then I also read this book that I'll talk about. But basically this one is The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. It's a short story by E.M. Forster, which basically predicts the internet and FaceTime and iPads and like the world we live in right now. And it was written in 1915, or like it was published in 1928, but I'm pretty sure it was written like at basically at the turn of the century, the last century, not this century, which is crazy. Like, it's so early. It was written at a time when the phone was just invented and it was starting to become popularized. And so Ian Forster took this little grain of modern technology, which is what a lot of like dystopian or speculative fiction authors do. They'll take like a grain of what's currently happening and they'll like project it onto an extreme, and they'll think like, what would happen if this actually became like much bigger than it is currently. And so the machine stops is about a world where everything is run by this one all-knowing, all-powerful, all benevolent machine built and designed by human beings, but so many generations ago that all humans have lost their ability to like not necessarily control it, but like fix it or mend it or build upon it or innovate. Like, the human capacity for creativity is kind of lost in the pursuit of efficiency, technology, convenience. So already that's like a really common critique that a lot of science fiction authors later on will have taken to say that that's basically the consequence of all of these innovations, is that humans are going to regress. So like The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is a really good example of that, and like the way that the future of humanity is like projected onto the future because of innovation and technology is like same as in The Machine Stops. But there's this one character in the book in the story that is really skeptical and is like, I don't think we should be following this machine. I don't think we should be, so certain that it's like all good and stuff. And he wants to like leave the system that everyone is basically like living underground, living in these little rooms. No one's talking to each other. No one's touching each other. Everything's happening through a screen. And you can hear everybody. You can tap into like basically Zoom conferencing. Literally, I was blown away. I was like, how is this book so timely now? No wonder it was like reprinted by Penguin Modern Classics. This is like a £3 reprint, but it's just phenomenal. Like, it's so predictive and it's so critical in quite a basic way. It's very much like the moral of the story is like the machine is bad, and we shouldn't like follow in the machine. And there's very much like a narrative of like nature versus the machine. So it's not very nuanced, but like given the fact that it was written over 100 years ago, I was blown away. It's so interesting, and I really loved it. There's another story in here, which is why I have the bookmark in, called The Celestial Omnibus, which is about a young boy taking a trip that his parents believe is impossible. I don't know what that means. I started reading it, but I wasn't as interested, so I just put it down. But The Machine Stops. Would highly recommend. I'm sure you can find it online for free, so you don't have to buy the book, but really, really interesting. As I said, I was really interested in machines, so I did also pick up To Be a Machine by Mark O'Connell. The subtitle is Adventures Among Cyborgs, Utopians, Hackers, and the Futurists Solving the Modest Problem of Death. It's basically a book about transhumanism, which is basically a movement whose aim is to use technology to fundamentally change the human condition, improve our bodies and minds to a point where we become something other and better than the animals that we are. Ooh. Okay, so this book freaked me out a lot. I will say it's phenomenally written. It's a popular science book, but it's also written by a journalist who used to be an English professor or an English PhD student at least. So he's a phenomenal writer, so well written, like genuinely reads like a work of literature, like what you would expect from that kind of writing. He references literature a lot, things like Icarus and the Odyssey and like big classic works of ancient literature, which I really appreciated, to like contextualize a lot of the questions and a lot of the ideals of transhumanism in like really old human beliefs. And so he talks also about like Descartes and like the Cartesian turn and like this idea of like mind over body, which is obviously fundamental to transhumanism. But it also really freaked me out because he's basically just conducting interviews. He's a journalist. He's going on this like quest to like ask people questions about what transhumanism means to them and what kind of stuff that they're building, and why. And so there's a lot of different topics he covers. He talks about the singularity and AI risk, which is kind of like a, you know, the idea of like the end of humanity or how it's going to come about. He talks about biology, disease, people trying to solve, chronic illness, things like that. And then he talks about death as a spiritual experience and faith and how that ties into each other, and what transhumanists believe about death and what religious people believe about death, and how that the ideal of eternal life is really ever present in most social sorry, the ideal of eternal life is present in a lot of these different communities, but how it manifests in transhumanism as a very much a scientific project that has a very specific end, and that loads of people with a lot of brain power are like attempting to reach. And Mark O'Connell has a very skeptical view towards all of this, and so you're kind of on his side a lot of the time, like if you're also a skeptic about transhumanism, and if you believe that like death is just part of life and what adds value to life, and suffering is inescapable and all of those things, then you're gonna be like along for the ride with Mark O'Connell of like questioning and all this stuff. But he does, I think, also give transhumanists a lot of the benefit of the doubt, and he really tries to understand their perspective. And it's just really freaky to think about people who are trying to escape their bodies and be put into either machines or improve their bodies purely for like efficiency's sake, and not necessarily to solve a certain disease or to help them be more able, but like to add like additional abilities, let's say. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say about this, except it's like a fantastic book that made me question a lot of stuff, and weirded me out a lot, but was very challenging to my own internalized ideology and bias about nature. And so it was interesting to have that question and to read from a different perspective. But yeah, really, really well written, great book, freaked me out. Not much else to say about that. And now we're on to the poetry. So I read a few poetry books recently. One of them that I don't know what to call this book. It's kind of a zine, it's kind of a book, it's kind of a journal. I found out my local magazine shop. And it's written by someone I don't even know the author's name. But their Instagram is as follows. There you go. And Now Hill, at And Now Hill. And basically this writer just like has photocopied loads of her ideas and journalings and doodles and sketches and meditations and poems into this little publication, and I thought it was really thought-provoking and really interesting. And I feel like this is how I journal a lot of the time, and a lot of my journals look like this, but I just really enjoyed being given access to someone else's journal in this way. So I really enjoyed this. Let me read you one of my favorite parts, which is just a little quote. Where did it go? Oh, here, this one. It says, every night I sleep with an altar at the foot of my bed. Some days I wake up and the duvet has covered it. Some days the duvet has not. This is how I know if my dreams were a spiritual matter or something I should keep covered from God. Really loved that. Really thought about that a lot afterwards. Another poetry collection I read was Hand in Hand, an anthology of love poems edited by Carol Ann Duffy. You guys know I love Carol Ann Duffy. I talk about her all the time. Fantastic poet. And this is an anthology was produced for Valentine's Day a number of years ago, and basically it's really interesting the way that Carol Ann Duffy has edited it, because she hasn't chosen any of the poems herself. She chose poets that she knew. She contacted them. She was like, could you share a poem of yours that's a love poem, and then also choose a poem from the opposite gender, a love poem written by a poet from the opposite gender as you, to share as well. So each poet that she chose, 36 poets, provided her with 2 poems, one of their own and one of their favorites from the opposite gender. I don't know how I feel about this opposite gender thing, because like I guess she wanted like a diversity of like equal men and women, but like where do non-binary people fit into that, and like whatever. But like really ended up with like a really diverse collection of poetry in here, and I loved this. Like I was reading this over the holidays before I fell ill, like just at the end of November, and I just thought it was like a really Christmassy vibe to read about love. Like, you know, a lot of us watch like holiday rom-coms for the holidays, and I feel like reading love poems, I just feel like love poems are the best poems. Love poems and heartbreak poems and nature poems like are the best poems. And there are so many love poems, and there are so many like grief and heartbreak poems that landed with me so deeply. And my favorite one was probably what is it called? To His Lost Lover by Simon Armitage. It's quite long and my voice is going, so I can't read it to you, but I will try to find it online and leave a link in the description if you'd like to read it yourself. It's beautiful, it's sad, it's so well written in my opinion. There are several others that I really enjoyed. There's one called Japan by Billy Collins that I really liked. Just like so many that in so many different like forms as well, because you know a lot of people write sonnets, but like loads of people write like free verse or haikus, or just like so many different forms. I love like poetry anthologies. This is probably the best poetry anthology I've read this year. I don't think I read many poetry anthologies this year, but this is like top notch. Really enjoyed it. Would highly recommend it. Hand in Hand. And yeah. And then I also I want to say reread, but I didn't actually read it before, like in this format. But I have read like most of Mary Oliver's writing at this point. But I did pick up Blue Horses by Mary Oliver. This one is a collection of hers that I'm gifting to my sister, and it's really beautiful. Yeah, it's quite short. I don't love the way that these editions, Corsair Poetry, have like decided to not print like on a certain, like they always want the poem to start on the right side, which I kind of get, but like it means a lot of the pages are wasted on these sides. So I'm not a huge fan of that, like the printing of it. But the poetry's excellent. You guys know I love Mary Oliver. Like, I don't know what else to say about it. This one is beautiful, as is all her poetry collections, and like, yeah, it brought me a lot of joy. And finally, I picked up The Tradition by Jericho Brown. This is a poetry book that won, I'm not sure if this poetry book won the Pulitzer Prize or if Jericho Brown won the Pulitzer Prize with his last collection, and this is his next collection. That's what it says on the back. And it says, like, it's basically a collection about being Black and British and queer, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it's genuinely like phenomenal. Like, I don't know how Jericho Brown writes the way that he writes, but it is just truly phenomenal. There's this one line that killed me. It literally killed me. It's like in the second poem of the collection, which is called As a Human Being. And it says, "There is the happiness you have and the happiness you deserve. They sit apart from each other the way you and your mother sat on opposite ends of the sofa after an ambulance came to take your father away." And just like the idea that the happiness that you have and the happiness you deserve are so far apart. And just like, it's just heartbreaking collection about violence against the Black body, against the queer body, what it's like to be struggling with your masculinity, with your relationship to your father as a Black man, with your relationship to your son as a Black man. You know, there's a beautiful poem in here, I wonder if I can remember its name, about letting yourself not be political when you, yeah, I think it's called Stand. So the poem is called Stand, and it's all about just making love and not always being, you know, waging the war on the ground, on the streets, like just waging the war in the sheets, like just holding someone as a political act, just being held and letting yourself feel safe, and not saying anything, even as the people that you love are being killed. And just that tore me open. And this was such a powerful, beautiful collection, one of the best I read this year, just on a technical level, but also like really left an impact on me. I really want to read the New Testament now, which is the collection of Jericho Brown's that has won the Pulitzer. And yeah, just was beautiful. So anyways, I've talked for an hour. I wonder if I'm gonna edit this, because I'm so ill, you guys. I don't know if I'll have the energy to do that. But thank you for joining me and hearing me talk about all these books. I hope that you have had a good few months of reading. I hope that you're healthy and not ill, and if you are ill, I hope you're taking care of yourself, and or that someone is taking care of you. Sending you lots of love, wishing you a very good new year. I am looking forward to doing different stuff with the channel in the new year, but I'll talk more about that in another video when I'm feeling a bit better. But yeah, take care of yourselves, and thanks for joining me. Bye.